Welcome. This week we're going to start with dissociative disorders. Dissociative disorders is a class of disorders characterized by a disruption of or a discontinuity in the normal integration of consciousness, memory, identity, emotion, perception, body representation, motor control, and/or behavior. It's important to note that this is not a break from reality like psychosis might be. This is a detachment. And actually, these symptoms are actually much more common than you might imagine. Typically, as we go through our day, our memories, our sense of who we are, our connection to our body, our connection to our consciousness, all of this is woven together as one coherent whole. But with the dissociative disorders, these are disconnected. But the idea of being in a dissociative state is very common. Anytime you've walked a few blocks or driven a car a couple of miles, and all of a sudden you realize that you don't remember what happened for the last few minutes, that's dissociation. And dissociation is actually a very normal part of human experience. Almost everyone can recall at least one time when this has happened. When we look at the symptoms of dissociation, we also note that these occur across a variety of other disorders. We saw dissociation in panic attacks, acute stress disorder, and in post-traumatic stress disorder. But moving into an actual diagnosable condition makes the dissociative disorders very, very rare. As a general rule, our consciousness, memory, identity, motor control, behavior, these are all perceived as a single continuous experience. But with dissociation, those symptoms become interrupted, and the continuity of that experience is interrupted. For those with dissociation, symptoms are experienced as spontaneous intrusions that the person did not conjure up, they didn't intentionally experience. The intrusions pop into their awareness or behavior and then cause a disconnect in their subjective experience. In addition to that, they can also have an inability to access information or to control mental functions that typically we anticipate being able to access and control easily. It's very common for people to experience dissociation after traumatic events. In fact, they are so closely related that the DSM event lists them separately after trauma and after the stress-related disorders. Our first disorder is depersonalization, derealization disorder. In the past, we only saw these as separate conditions, but they've now put them together as one disorder because they found that people can have one of these symptoms or the other, or even have both. And clinically, there were no distinct differences between any of those groups. So now they've put it together as one condition. The two primary factors for diagnosis are persistent or recurrent depersonalization or derealization. And they would only get the disorder if they have impairment or significant distress as a result of these symptoms. So let's talk about the two symptoms that we're referring to. Depersonalization, you can think of this as some kind of detachment from them as a person, whereas derealization is some kind of detachment from the world in the sense of the world not being real. So going back to depersonalization, here individuals experience detachment, unreality, or a sense of being outside, an outside observer for their thoughts, feelings, body sensations, or actions. They feel detached from or unfamiliar with themselves as a whole, or maybe even as just a part. They might feel like one of their limbs doesn't feel real. Common complaints are feeling robotic, feeling as if they don't have control over themselves, having an out-of-body experience. Sometimes there are perceptual alterations, a distorted sense of time, feeling like they're not real themselves or they're absent. And there can also be emotional numbing or physical numbing. Derealization is a little bit different because the outside world seems like it's not real or it's detached in some way. Again, they feel fully connected to their self, but the outside world seems altered. This could be feeling like they're in a bubble or that there's glass between themselves and the world. Maybe sounds seem to be muted or they're amplified. Around the world, less than 2% of the population will ever have significant enough symptoms to warrant a diagnosis of depersonalization, derealization disorder. But again, roughly 50% of the adult population will experience a brief depersonalization episode. Again, this idea of you're driving down the street and you kind of come back to and realize you've gone 6 blocks, but you don't really remember what was happening. There is a clear link between this condition and having a childhood history of interpersonal trauma, but you'll see that that link is much stronger for some of the other disorders that we're going to talk about. Often, individuals with this condition will have a history of emotional abuse or neglect, but they may also have other kinds of childhood traumas, such as witnessing domestic abuse or having a parent that is severely impaired or has a significant mental illness. There can be an unexpected death or suicide of a family member or close friend. And although it's not as common, you might also see a history of childhood sexual abuse. I'm sure most of you have heard of amnesia, where someone for some reason cannot remember key aspects of their life or experience. Here we're talking about dissociative amnesia, where the essential feature is that they have some kind of memory loss. But what's important here is that the memory loss is the result of psychological stressors, not a medical factor. For example, if someone is in a car accident and they have amnesia, you would want to know, did they have any injury to their brain, or did their head hit anything? Because if they did, or if they had oxygen loss, they may have amnesia, but it could be because of a physical or an organic cause. Something actually happened that caused damage to their brain. With dissociative amnesia, there would not be anything medical or physical to explain their condition. We break amnesia into several different types. Again, all of these refer to dissociative amnesia. It can be a localized amnesia, where they have loss of memory for a period of time. And this can be broader than a single traumatic event. It can include amnesia for months or years of childhood or combat, for example. This is actually the most common type, and we see this often when individuals have trauma. They may forget they may not remember periods of time during that trauma, or they may not remember whole patches of their childhood. As an example, imagine a woman is attacked and found wandering around, but she can't remember what happened for the last 24 hours of her life. In selective amnesia, there's a loss of memory for certain events during a period of time. So they may remember part of a traumatic event, but not remember other parts. For example, somebody going to the grocery store and there's a robbery, but they don't remember seeing whether or not the person who is robbing them had a weapon in their hand. This would not be because they didn't actually see it. It would be because, for psychological reasons, their brain kind of blanked out on whether or not there was a weapon. And then generalized amnesia is pretty rare. Here we see a complete memory loss. They don't know who they are, where they live. They don't remember family, how they go about doing things they used to know how to do. This is more common among combat veterans as well as sexual assault victims. So this is, in essence, very common for pretty severe trauma. We don't actually know how common dissociative amnesia is if we just looked at a 12-month prevalence. They've done some community studies and they have estimates that show that maybe it's around 1.5% to 2%, but that hasn't been validated as far as anything across the country or across the world. It seems to be that there are more cases of this with women, and if you think about the most common causes are sexual assault or combat, that might partially explain why women are more likely to have dissociative amnesia. They have 2.6% compared to men having less than 2%. Individuals who have generalized amnesia, where they've just forgotten everything, tend to have a very abrupt onset that is directly corresponding to when the stressor or traumatic event happened. But for localized or selective amnesia, we don't have a good sense of how long it will last, what is going to be the course, and we have seen that it can be delayed, where maybe they had memories initially, but then later on they could no longer remember all of the details or remember all of the event. We do know that there can be an abrupt remission associated with distress, meaning that suddenly these symptoms can return if they have distress, and this can also include if they are experiencing suicidal thoughts or if they have PTSD. Remember, with some of the other disorders, we talked about having specifiers. These are extra pieces that you add to the diagnosis that give us a better picture of what their specific case looks like. And one of the specifiers is dissociative amnesia with dissociative fugue. Dissociative fugue used to be its own disorder separate from dissociative amnesia, and now it's a specifier of dissociative amnesia. Here, what's specific about dissociative fugue is that they experience sudden, unexpected travel from home or work. They might be bewildered and wandering. They have amnesia for their identity of who they are and for other important autobiographical information. What's their name? What's their occupation? Where do they live? Typically, what you find is that they were experiencing an extreme stressor, and by flying, by leaving, they are leaving behind that stressful situation. As an example, you might have someone who is experiencing an extreme stress at work. Maybe they lost a big account, or they are going to be in trouble for something that happened, and suddenly they get up and they drive 100 miles away and they stay for a week, and while they're gone, they're not able to recall their past while they're traveling. And sometimes they may even go as far as assuming a new identity. What's critical about this is that new identity is pretty underdeveloped, different from how we will see in dissociative identity disorder in a few minutes. For example, and it can be that it's something consistent with who they've been, or it could be a radical departure. So someone might go from being an upstanding citizen to being somebody who now steals or does drugs, as an example. The prevalence of this is less than 0.2% of the general population. So this is extremely, extremely, extremely rare. And if it ever happens, there's typically a very abrupt onset, and that onset happens at the same time as a stressful traumatic event, and then suddenly the symptoms will remit, they go away. And this will, we especially will see this if the traumatic events or the stressor can be processed and resolved, then suddenly it will completely remit. The other important piece is dissociative amnesia with dissociative fugue is typically a one-time event. Someone may have this experience, it happens to them once in their lifetime, and it never happens again. If it happens multiple times, it's likely that this is a misdiagnosis. Dissociative identity disorder has had different names in history. You may have also heard it talked of as multiple personality disorder, and often it was confused with schizophrenia, where people, I remember seeing a t-shirt when I was younger that said, "I'm schizophrenic and I am too," as if schizophrenia involved two distinct personalities within the individual. Well, there have been lots of errors in how people have thought about this condition, and a lot of confusion. Originally, this was put into the DSM as multiple personality disorder in 1980 with the DSM-3. but we know that there are documented cases that would fit our criteria for dissociative identity disorder that go all the way back before the 1800s. With DID, we see a disruption of identity that's characterized by at least two distinct personality states. The two personality states experience marked discontinuity in sense of self and sense of agency that's accompanied by related alterations in affect, behavior, consciousness, memory, perception, cognition, or sensory motor functioning. This basically means that if you think about yourself and then think of the other personality, that you're not going to have memory of what's happening when the other personality is present, and that other personality may have a different kind of disposition. They might be really funny and partier where maybe you're not. They'll also have distinct memories and experiences and functioning that you don't have in your everyday life. Individuals with DID have recurrent gaps in their ability to remember what was going on in their day-to-day life. They may have challenges remembering personal information or remembering different traumatic events that happened. These recurrent gaps in recall can be thought of as recurrent episodes of dissociative amnesias. And these dissociative amnesias show up in three primary ways. They may have gaps in the remote memory of personal life events. So they may not remember what happened around their childhood or around a death of a parent. Or they could have lapses in dependable memory. This is the memory of what happens in a day-to-day. How do you drive a car? How do you use a computer? Or they may discover evidence of activities that would happen in a given day, but they don't actually remember them happening. Having objects appear in their house that they don't remember ever buying, or writings on their notepads that they don't remember writing, or even coming to while doing something. Maybe they suddenly come to and they're in the shower, but the last thing they remember was sitting in class. And these individuals will commonly have dissociative fugues, where they suddenly wake up and they've traveled, whereas again they were in class, now they're at the beach. Or the last thing they remember was being at the grocery store, but all of a sudden they wake up, they come back, and now they're back in class. So they may wake up at the beach or club, they have no recall of how they got there or what happened. And of course, what's going on is that a different personality is engaging those behaviors, and the primary person doesn't remember what happened when they weren't there. Dissociative identity disorder is not something that happens very often, and when it does occur, it's typically associated with severe trauma. Over 90% of those with dissociative identity disorder, or DID, report that they experienced multiple types of interpersonal maltreatment as children. This includes sexual abuse, physical abuse, severe neglect, and may also have had other traumatizing experiences, such as medical or surgical experiences, being forced into childhood prostitution, or acts of terrorism. Over 70% of DID patients, outpatients, attempt suicide, and many have multiple suicide attempts and engage in other self-mutilation behaviors. It's important to note that we see this condition around the world, even though different places and cultures have different ways of understanding what's happening. So some cultures may report that these are demon possessions, and it's distinct from any culturally accepted form of possession. There are documented cases of an individual having as many as 100 different identities that are all coexisting within the same body. They may have an aggressive personality, one that's a math whiz, another one that can be extremely rational and thoughtful. They can have personalities that are very similar to the original person and some that are extremely different, and they may be of different ages and genders. There can also be differences between the identities that are often thought of as pretty rooted within an individual. They may have their own behavior, tone of voice, gestures, but we even can see that they may have different eyeglass prescriptions, may write with a different hand, and may actually have biological responses that we typically do not think of as being under someone's individual control, such as their resting heart rate or their galvanic skin response. This can end up leading to some strange situations. One might wake up and discover that they're in bed with somebody that they don't know. They may discover they're wearing clothes that they would never actually wear. And some of the identities can be very robust and fairly independent, and others can be really more of kind of a shell of a person with very few distinct characteristics. Most individuals who have DID will have at least one personality that can be very impulsive, and also have one that is a gender that they do not identify with. They can have physical transformation, like I mentioned earlier. There have been documented differences in vision and psychophysiological responses. The original personality or the original person is typically unaware of the alters. There's a video in this week's list of movies of the 3 Faces of Eve, and you'll hear on the video that the woman will talk about not knowing where she herself was when someone else was out and present to the outside world, and that some of the alters know one another, but some of them do not. And interestingly, you'll hear her talk about being afraid of treatment because it means somebody is going to have to die. And she says, "I'd like to live." Individuals with DID often have no idea of what condition they have. And when they present for therapy, it's often because they're overwhelmed with trying to keep everything together and try to function in day-to-day society while having these major gaps in their memory and in their activities, and feeling like they're not able to stay in control throughout the day. They often begin to realize something is wrong because they might encounter people that refer to them by a different name, or people tell them of events that they were at, but they don't themselves remember any of those activities, or finding belongings and clothes that they don't remember and perhaps they would not typically wear. What causes someone to switch from personality A to personality B? Well, there's a lot of variability in why that can happen. They might encounter an event that is reminiscent of the trauma they've experienced. They may have a strong emotion, or they, like a child that's being threatened by a bully, may switch into an aggressive personality that can help. Or they may need a skill set that one personality has, the others don't. For example, if one's really good at math. This might be a great opportunity to stop the video and then go to our D2L group and watch the video of Tony, and he talks about his switches and what causes some of his switches. The kinds of severe abuse, neglect, or trauma that individuals experience can lead to a desire to try to escape the situation, and especially when they're children, one of the only ways that they can escape is through kind of dissociating and kind of leaving their body. But the dissociation is actually helpful because it gets them out of that unbearable situation. For example, a child can't control the parent's abuse, and they develop a fantasy life that allows them to escape it in their head. And for some, this fantasy life perhaps becomes a bit of a reality. We also know that those who go on to develop DID are often very highly suggestible. This can be partially related to their age because children, one, we typically only see DID develop in very young children and then last throughout their lifetime. And children's kind of perceptions of reality are more malleable, and this allows them to be more easily influenced by factors that are external to them. We also know that these individuals tend to be highly hypnotizable. Some of the implications of that, it may be associated with an ability to have a rich fantasy life. Over 50% of those with DID had imaginary playmates as children, but again, most of the people with imaginary playmates never go on to develop DID. This rich fantasy life can create an increased chance of using dissociation as a defense mechanism. So deal with the abuse by imagining they're a wrestler beating up an opponent. This could lead to the development of an aggressive personality, as an example. Although it's very, very rare, alters could potentially be created by leading therapists. The suggestibility could lead to a tendency to believe therapists who suggest that the person presents alters, and then the person might exhibit that because it's been suggested to them. And this would mean we'd want to rule out a conscious or an unconscious faking, or a conscious faking or an unconscious malingering. Malingering refers to intentionally exaggerating or faking symptoms in order to get secondary gains. And secondary gains are kind of those nice things that happen for you, maybe people helping you more, people checking in to see how you're doing. Malingering is not intentional, it is unconscious. There was a huge increase in the number of people that were diagnosed after the movie The Three Faces of Eve, and then the movie Sybil came out. Sybil came out in 1979. The new DSM was released in 1980 and suddenly included multiple personality disorder. One of the questions is, what's going on that a movie shows this disorder and now all of a sudden we see this huge increase in cases? Of course, one possibility is that this is increasing the number of fake cases or false cases. And this might happen because of a therapist's suggestion or something of that nature. But what we think is actually at play is that there was an increased recognition of the symptoms and what they meant. For example, individuals watching that movie and notice, well, I lose time. I have people talk to me and claim I'm somebody else. I have people tell me I did things that I don't remember doing. Similarly, therapists, most therapists will never in their life see a case of DID. So a therapist might be working with someone and then realize that the person met this diagnosis. And there's also some question about, is dissociative identity disorder maybe in a very extreme form of post-traumatic stress disorder, given that we do see dissociation in PTSD. Well, the difference between PTSD and DID as it comes to diagnosis is that the DID symptoms are focused on dissociation rather than focused on a particular trauma response. Dissociative identity disorder is very, very rare when we look at the general public. So in a large non-clinical sample, we'll see this perhaps 0.5%. But when we look at severely disturbed inpatient samples, this rate jumps from 3 to 6%. And this really is an indication that many of the individuals with this condition are really struggling to function in day-to-day life and end up often institutionalized among the severely disturbed. But there are also many people that are able to function, particularly with early treatment and integration. We almost always see that the age of onset is going to be early childhood, but it's almost never diagnosed in childhood because, of course, these are often children with severe trauma and abuse. They're not often getting much mental health care by people that are abusing them. And so it's often not until years later, often even decades later, that they are brought to the attention of medical and psychiatric personnel and get an appropriate diagnosis. The mean number of alters for those that have this condition is 15. And we see that in general, women are more likely to have a larger number of alters, with women averaging at 15 and men averaging at having 8. And when this condition shows up, it is chronic and lifelong, although there is treatment that can help them function better in society. Unfortunately, the gravity and severity of this disorder and the difficulty it is to effectively treat this disorder makes it so that the prognosis is fairly guarded. It's hard to be very optimistic about this diagnosis. However, there are more and more individuals that are learning how to effectively treat this condition. And with treatment, the person may still have symptoms lifelong, or they actually can come to full integration. But there is a way of getting to the place where even if they have altered personalities still, they're working in collaboration and working together for the betterment of the whole. In treatment, the goal would be to figure out what it is that triggers them to go into a dissociative episode or to have another personality switch. And if you can identify what those are, you can do techniques to help neutralize the impact of that trigger. And then help individuals process the early trauma that they experienced that led to the need for dissociative identity disorder and the need for some of those personalities. And then help them gain some kind of psychological control over the experiences that they had, so that they're no longer able to trigger them and force them into another personality or even the development of new personalities. Here you see links to two additional videos. These are also available as links from our D2L website. The introduction video is a great one to watch, and it shows Kim Noble with some of the different personalities and some of the experiences. The art therapy video is optional. It does have some content that can be very distressing, in that she talks about some of the trauma that led to the development of the multiple personalities and has some of her artwork that depicts some of the trauma. So I leave it to you to decide if you want to see that second video. And of course, as with any of our content, you are able to elect out if you're finding yourself triggered.